A woman in a bright red coat stood beside the rainy Seattle waterfront, cherry blossoms drifting in the wind as two tiny black-furred German shepherd pups trembled in her arms, the pair she had found abandoned beneath the old pier, left to fade into the cold spring night. That morning, Madison Clark, tech heiress, polished, untouchable, never expected her path to collide with two lives so fragile they barely breathed. But when she stepped beneath the rusted beams of the docks, the pups stirred. A faint whimper, a plea the city had ignored. What Madison chose to do next, and the fight that awaited her at Skyline Paws, would unravel secrets about compassion, survival, and the courage to stand against a system built to look away. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Spring in Seattle has a way of turning even the smallest heartbeat into a miracle. Seattle in early spring carried a strange kind of melancholy, rain falling in soft silver threads, blurring the skyline into a watercolor wash of blues and grays. The cherry blossoms along the waterfront were in half bloom, their pale petals drifting across the walkways like confetti from a celebration that the city was too tired to attend. Fog clung low over Elliott Bay, swallowing the corners of old piers and abandoned warehouses until they looked more like ghostly silhouettes than structures built by human hands. Cars whispered across the wet pavement, and the steady hum of the ferries echoed through the harbor, a symphony of movement under a sky that refused to lift its veil. Against that backdrop, Madison Clark stepped out of the glass-paneled ballroom of the Langford Hotel, a place where people pretended problems dissolved under chandeliers and champagne. She paused beneath the awning as the rain misted her red evening coat, a vibrant slash of color against the washed-out world. Madison, 35, carried the kind of polished beauty that came from discipline rather than vanity. Long dark hair pulled into a sleek twist, high cheekbones, and a posture so poised it suggested she'd spent years holding herself together through sheer will. Her eyes, a cool hazel with flecks of gold, betrayed fatigue beneath the expertly applied makeup. The gala had drained her. Too many hands shaken, too many promises made, too many people treating her like a miracle worker simply because she had money. She shifted her weight, the hem of her expensive black gown brushing her ankles. The faint floral perfume she wore mingled with the sharper scent of cold rain, and for a moment she closed her eyes, trying to breathe past the tightness that had settled in her chest since the applause faded. Madison was the founder of Clark Venture Equity, a tech investment fund that most of the city worshipped like a golden idol. She was also the primary donor of Skyline Paws Rescue, a shelter tucked in a converted warehouse on the south side of town. People admired her, envied her, whispered about her, but none of them knew the truth burning like a coal in her ribcage. She slept poorly, woke often, and carried a grief so heavy it had shaped the way she walked. Her fiancé, Evan Hartley, had died in a plane crash 6 years earlier. Evan, tall, sharp-witted, always smelling faintly of cedar, had been the one to convince her to start funding animal rescues, claiming that healing something small could help heal someone large. He didn't survive his flight home from Denver. Madison did. Somehow the universe had chosen her, and the guilt still crawled beneath her skin like frost. She descended the hotel steps, heels tapping lightly, and headed toward her car, a sleek black electric coupe that gleamed despite the drizzle. Her driver was off for the night. She preferred to drive alone after events. It made her feel less on display. She slid into the leather seat, exhaled, and checked her phone. Her screen lit with an incoming call from Ben Turner, the night security guard she knew from the old waterfront industrial zone. Ben was in his late 50s, short-built but tough, with a weathered face framed by a salt-and-pepper beard. He had the air of someone who'd worked hard his whole life without ever raising his voice. His calm demeanor came from years in the Coast Guard, though he rarely talked about those days, except when he'd had too much coffee. Madison answered. "Ben, what's wrong?" His voice came through ragged wind muffled behind him. "Ms. Clark, sorry to bother you. It's something down by Pier 17, under the old loading deck." "Tell me." "A German Shepherd mama. Looked like she'd been surviving on scraps. She went into labor right on the wet concrete. Most of the pups look strong enough, but 2 of them." His breath hitched slightly, and Madison tensed. Ben was not a man who rattled easily. "They're tiny," he continued. "Black-furred, barely moving. Mama's pushing them off. She's out of strength. I don't think they'll last long." Madison looked out through her rain-streaked windshield toward the dark stretch of shoreline in the distance. Her pulse quickened in a way she couldn't suppress. Skyline Paws was already stuffed wall to wall. Seattle's new city ordinance had reduced capacity limits, and the staff had been scrambling for months to meet compliance. She could practically hear Sarah's voice in her head. Sarah Bennett, the shelter's operations manager, a thin, soft-spoken woman in her 40s with curly brown hair and round glasses. Sarah, who handled spreadsheets the way a surgeon handled scalpels, and always reminded Madison, gently but firmly, that money couldn't solve everything. But money wasn't the point right now. 2 lives were fading under a pier. Madison's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "Send me the location," she said quietly. "I'm already heading your way." "Ms. Clark, you sure? It's wet and slick down here, and send it, Ben." She hung up before she could talk herself out of it. She glanced down at herself. Silk gown, 4-inch heels, red coat worth enough to pay a month's rent for a family of 4. Useless, all of it. She switched off the car's lights and pulled out into the rain-muted night. Seattle blurred past in streaks of neon and silver as she turned down a narrow side road leading toward the waterfront's forgotten edge. When she finally rolled to a stop beside the rusted skeleton of the old pier, Madison stepped out into the chilled drizzle. She opened her door slowly, breath fogging in the air, and peered beneath the dark slats of the timber beams. 2 tiny black shapes trembled there, barely more than shadows against the wet concrete. They huddled close, their frail bodies rising and falling in shallow, desperate motions. Madison froze, heartbeat loud in her ears, realizing she was about to break every rule she'd spent years enforcing. And yet, she couldn't take a single step back. Not tonight. Not with those 2 small shadows waiting in the rain. Rain drummed softly against the rotting beams overhead as Madison stepped deeper beneath the pier, the scent of seawater and rust swirling around her with every hesitant breath. The dim glow from the street lamp above filtered through the slats of wood, casting fractured beams of gold across the slick concrete floor. The shadows near the back shifted, and as her eyes adjusted, the scene took shape. A frail German Shepherd mother curled around a nest of damp pallets, her ribs visible beneath matted fur. She looked no older than 4, yet hardship had carved prematurely into her frame. Her coat, once black and tan, had dulled to a smudged slate, and her eyes held the fierce, raw vigilance of an animal who had survivanted by instinct alone. Clustered against her belly were 5 strong pups, round-bodied, glossy-coated, nursing noisily. But 2 tiny black-furred pups lay apart from the rest, pressed dangerously close to a shallow pool of water that rippled each time the wind rattled the pier. Their bodies were absurdly small, the size of her palms, shivering uncontrollably, breaths barely visible. Instinct had made the mother choose. Resources were limited, warmth even more so. The weak had been pushed to the margins of survival. Madison lowered herself to her knees, the cold water soaking into the satin of her gown. The mud smeared across the red coat at her shoulders, but she didn't feel the chill, only the familiar punch of helplessness. Her fingers trembled as memories fluttered to the surface like torn paper in a storm. Years ago, in a sterile white hospital room, a doctor's voice had broken over her world as gently and cruelly as falling snow. "We can only stabilize one. You have to choose." Evan's face flashed in her mind. His crooked smile, the small scar near his eyebrow from a childhood biking accident, the faint smell of cedar he always carried, his hand slipping from hers as machines screamed around them. The guilt never left her. It settled over her life like a second skin. Now, watching the two abandoned pups, that same impossible choice echoed back with surgical precision. You can't save them all. Madison swallowed hard. "Not again," she whispered, voice trembling. "Not like this." She reached toward the nearest pup when a low growl vibrated through the air. Deep, resonant, wrong. Madison froze. From the black mouth of the service tunnel beside the pallets, a massive shape emerged. A stray male German Shepherd mix, easily 90 pounds, stepped into the fractured light. His fur was thick but filthy, clumped with grease and streaked with dark patches of old fights. His ears bore tears as if ripped by teeth long ago, and one eye had a cloudy scar across the iris, giving him a cold, shark-like stare. This was no starving stray. This was a king of the refuse, built by violence and sharpened by hunger. His name floated through among the dock workers, Breaker, the stray who ruled the scrapyards. And now he smelled opportunity, a weakened mother, newborn pups, unclaimed food. Madison's pulse spiked as Breaker's gaze fixed on the huddled family. The mother lifted her head, exposing her teeth with a guttural snarl. She pushed her strong pups further beneath her body and limped forward, her back leg trembling with fresh injury. Instinct placed her between Breaker and her litter, even as she seemed barely able to stand. Madison felt panic claw at her ribs. She couldn't outrun a dog like Breaker. Her only instincts screamed contradictory orders. Grab the abandoned two. Don't move. Step back. Step forward. Her breath fogged the air as she tried to calculate an impossible equation. Rain hammered harder above, vibrating through the beams like a drum roll. Breaker lowered his head, shoulders rolling, muscles flexing beneath his dirty coat. He emitted a sound that was more rumble than growl, a warning or a promise. Madison stumbled one step back, terrified to provoke him. The mother barked sharply, a thin, painful sound, but filled with a fire that made Madison's chest ache. She was starving, injured, exhausted, yet she stood fiercely, a wall of trembling courage. Breaker lunged. Madison's instincts fired too late. She jerked upward, slipping on the wet concrete. Her hands shot out to brace herself, nearly falling into the puddle beside the tiny pups. The mother launched herself upward with desperate fury, intercepting Breaker mid-charge. Their bodies collided with a forceful thud that echoed through the pier like a gunshot. Madison scrambled backward on hands and knees, dress tearing against the concrete. She watched helplessly as Breaker snapped his enormous jaws, teeth clashing inches from the mother's throat. She countered with a snarl, biting down hard on his foreleg. Breaker roared, shaking her violently. Madison's thoughts blurred. If he kills her, the strong pups won't survive either. If she intervenes, Breaker might turn on her. If she does nothing, the two abandoned pups will die before her eyes. Water dripped rhythmically from the beams above, mixing with the growls, the scrapes of claws on concrete. The scene tightened around her until all that existed was fear, desperation, and the two tiny black shadows shivering beside her torn gown. Breaker planted his paws and threw the mother aside with a devastating shove. She skidded across the concrete, yelping as she hit a stack of crates. Breaker's head snapped toward the pups, toward all of them, toward her. Madison's lungs seized. She pushed herself up, mud, silk, rain, everything clinging heavily, and for the first time in years, her body moved without hesitation, without fear, without guilt's heavy chain. Breaker's growl deepened, echoing off the pier walls as he prepared to lunge again. Madison stepped directly into his line of charge. The world seemed to hold its breath as predator and human locked eyes, one wild, one determined, both ready to break rules carved into bone and memory. Then Breaker sprang. Breaker's body slammed into a stack of crates, the crash echoing beneath the pier like distant thunder. The stray scrambled upright with a furious bark, but the mother German shepherd, blood streaking her hind leg, exhaustion trembling through her frame, did not back down. She lunged again, snapping her jaws with a desperate courage that belonged only to a mother protecting what little she had left. Breaker, startled by her sudden ferocity, hesitated just long enough for the wind to shift and carry the scent of heavy machinery from the docks. A forklift beeped in the distance. Breaker's scarred ears flicked toward the noise, instincts warning him of approaching danger. With a final growl aimed at Madison and the pups, he retreated into the darkness of the tunnel, his massive frame disappearing like a bad memory, slipping into deeper shadow. The mother stumbled back toward her litter. She nudged her stronger pups under her chest before collapsing onto her side, panting shallowly. Her breaths rasped, each inhale a struggle. Madison crawled closer, her gown soaked, her hair clinging to her face in wet strands. She scanned the mother's injuries, bite marks along the shoulder, a torn pad, a swollen paw. The dog's eyes lifted to meet hers, dark and pleading, almost apologetic. Madison swallowed the ache rising in her throat. The mother had fought with everything she had left. Now she needed help too. But the two tiny black pups beside Madison caught her attention with a force so sharp it stole her breath. They lay half unmoving, their fur slick and cold, their bodies trembling in faint, fragile shivers. One let out a sound, less a cry and more a whisper of life trying to cling on. Madison reached out, fingertips brushing their icy fur. "I won't leave you," she murmured. "Not like before. Not this time." Her phone buzzed violently in her pocket, jolting her back to the world. She pulled it free, fumbling with wet hands. The caller ID read Sarah Bennett. Sarah, the operations manager of Skyline Paws, was a woman known for her calm but unyielding demeanor. In her mid-40s, tall and narrow-boned, with gentle brown curls always pinned back loosely, and wire-framed glasses perpetually sliding down her small nose, she looked more like a school librarian than someone who wrangled dogs for a living. But beneath her quiet exterior was a fierce, organized mind, a woman who could manage budgets, volunteers, and crises with the precision of a military strategist. Madison answered breathlessly. "Sarah, I found 2 pups. They're freezing. The mother, she's injured. I need a team down here. There was a pause, then Sarah's voice came through, steady but edged with worry. Madison, the city's new intake limit went into effect today. We cannot legally bring in more high-risk newborns unless they'll die if we wait, Madison snapped, cradling the pups closer. Madison, Sarah said more firmly, if we break intake protocol, they could shut the shelter down permanently. You know how Doyle works. He's looking for a reason. Richard Doyle. Just hearing his name twisted something in Madison's stomach. Doyle, the city's chief animal welfare inspector, was a man carved out of sharp angles, late 50s, gaunt cheeks, steel-gray hair slicked back with ruthless precision, and a jawline that looked built for clenching. His hazel eyes were flat, unreadable, the kind that missed nothing and forgave even less. He was infamous for citing shelters over the smallest violations. Rumor had it his wife had once run an independent rescue that collapsed under financial strain, and he blamed idealistic animal lovers who don't understand limits. Whether true or not, his approach was pragmatic to the point of cruelty. Sarah, Madison whispered, voice cracking as she pressed the pups against the warmth of her chest. I'm bringing them in. Tell the team to prep the warming station. Before Sarah could respond, Madison ended the call. There was no time for debate. Gathering the two pups carefully into her arms, she pushed herself upright, her high heels slipping on the wet concrete. She kicked them off, barefoot on the cold ground, ignoring the bite of the cold as she maneuvered back toward her car. She cast one final glance at the mother. I'll come back for you, she promised. I swear it. The drive back to Skyline Paws blurred into a tunnel of rain-swept roads and adrenaline. Madison cranked the heater to full blast, then shrugged off her red coat. Cashmere, custom-tailored, worth more than some people's rent, and wrapped the pups inside before pressing them directly against her skin. Their cold seeped into her bones. She curled her arms around them, rubbing their backs gently, whispering encouragement as if her voice alone could keep them tethered to life. Some heiress you are, she muttered to herself with a wry laugh, using a $5,000 coat as a puppy incubator. But the humor didn't mask her fear. One pup had stopped shivering entirely. That wasn't a good sign. When she burst through the doors of Skyline Paws, the small team sprang into motion. The lobby smelled of wet fur, antiseptic, and industrial cleaner. Stainless steel kennels lined the walls, and veterinary charts littered the front desk. Dr. Elliot Marsh, the shelter's veterinarian, strode toward her. He was in his early 40s, medium built with sandy blonde hair kept in a messy bun, a well-trimmed beard, and kind blue eyes that carried deep shadows from too many sleepless nights. He had once worked in a private clinic, but left after burning out on wealthy owners who treated pets like accessories. At Skyline Paws, he found purpose, though the financial strain weighed heavily on him. He peeled back the coat slowly. Temperatures dangerously low, he murmured. Lungs sound wet. His brows creased in a pained wince. One of them barely has a reflex. Madison's stomach sank as Elliot whisked the pups toward the emergency warming chamber, a makeshift incubator fashioned from a heated bassinet and old neonatal equipment. But before Madison could follow, the front door swung open with a thud. Richard Doyle stepped inside, holding a clipboard thick with forms. His coat dripped rain onto the floor like ticking seconds. His gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating. Ms. Clark, he said coldly, we need to talk about intake violations. Madison turned toward the emergency room window, watching the pups lie motionless in their blankets as the warming lamps flickered on. Doyle's heavy footsteps approached, each one tightening the noose around everything she had built. The chapter closed on the image of Madison standing between the fragile glow of life and the man poised to extinguish the only chance those two little shadows had left. The hum of the warming lamps filled the small emergency room like a heartbeat, steady, fragile, refusing to give up. Madison remained rooted beside the incubator, her red coat draped over a nearby chair, the fabric still damp from the rain. Her hair, usually immaculate, had loosened from its twist, soft waves falling around her tired face. She hadn't slept more than an hour in the past 2 nights, but exhaustion only sharpened her determination. Dr. Elliot Marsh hovered nearby, continually checking vitals, his brows furrowed as he adjusted the miniature oxygen tubes fixed near the pups' noses. His hands were deft yet gentle, movements born from years of saving animals no one else bothered to fight for. He looked as though he wanted to say something, perhaps another warning about intake limits or recovery odds. But one glance at Madison's expression convinced him to hold his tongue. There was a resolve in her eyes he'd only seen in grieving families refusing to sign DNR forms. Sarah Bennett peeked into the room periodically, her slender frame filling the doorway briefly each time before she retreated to the office to field emails and update budget sheets. She never intruded long. She respected moments that were too raw to be witnessed. But her presence, quiet, steady, anchored the shelter. People underestimated Sarah's soft voice. They didn't realize softness could be iron when needed. Madison finally signed the intake override papers with trembling fingers. The documents named her personally responsible for all expenses related to the pup's treatment, a commitment large enough to scare off anyone without deep pockets or deeper conviction. After signing, she pressed her thumb firmly against the form, sealing a decision that she felt as much in her heart as in her wallet. She named them, or rather whispered their names into the warm air of the incubator, as if giving them a piece of her breath. "Shadow," she murmured to the pup on the left, the slightly larger one whose fur shone with a faint sheen under the warming lamp. His coat was a soft, midnight black, with a lighter smudge near his paw, a faint birthmark. "And you?" She touched the smaller one with utmost care. Midnight. This one's fur was ink dark and shaggier, his body thinner, his breaths uneven. They were shadows of the night beneath that pier, fragile, forgotten, surviving on the slimmest thread. Hours later, the crisis arrived. Midnight's chest stopped rising. Dr. Elliot reacted first, swooping in and lifting the tiny pup. His movements were quick but not frantic. He knew panic killed clarity. He placed the pup on a heated cloth and began rhythmic pressure on its chest with 2 fingers. "Madison," he said gently but firmly, "you need to prepare yourself. He may not respond. Sometimes helping them pass is—" "No." The word broke out of her like a sob. Madison pushed forward, her hands shaking as she reached for Midnight. Elliot hesitated, then stepped aside, recognizing something in her expression, something painful, personal, immovable. She cupped the tiny body and began the compressions herself, her breaths quick and uneven. She lowered her mouth to the pup's tiny muzzle and breathed warmth into his lungs. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered, voice trembling. "I've already lost enough. You stay. You hear me? You stay." Her tears splashed onto his fur, plip, plip, mixing with the warmth of her breath. A tiny twitch, then a small gasp. Madison broke into a half-laugh, half-sob, shoulders shaking with disbelief and joy. Midnight's fragile heartbeat steadied, faint but real. The room felt lighter, as if the air itself exhaled. 2 days later, in the quiet hours before dawn, Shadow opened his eyes. Dark, glossy, alert, far too full of life for someone who had nearly slipped away. He pushed feebly onto his paws, wobbling with the determination of a creature who had never known safety, but somehow trusted the world anyway. He lifted his head toward Madison and released a single hoarse bark, thin, raspy, but brave. It wasn't loud, but it rang through the room with the weight of a miracle. Sarah heard it from the hall and gasped. Elliot sank into a chair, scrubbing his face. Madison froze, then laughed softly, covering her mouth as tears fell again. It was Shadow's triumph that nudged Midnight forward. By evening, the smaller pup stirred, eyelids fluttering. He looked toward the sound of Madison's voice and tried to stand, legs trembling. Every breath he took was effort, but he pressed on inch by inch. Hope bloomed, which was exactly when trouble returned. Richard Doyle arrived without warning, this time flanked by 2 city employees and a woman with a large shoulder-mounted camera. The reporter was young, sharp-eyed, with a bob of jet-black hair and a quick, assessing gaze. She introduced herself as Lana Ortiz, a local journalist known for exposing mismanaged shelters and corrupt city programs. She had a no-nonsense attitude, smelled faintly of peppermint, and radiated a hunger for stories that made officials nervous. Doyle wasted no time. He strode into the incubator room, ignoring Elliot's protests. "We are here to confirm intake violations," he declared, flipping through his clipboard with cold efficiency. "And if necessary, relocate the animals to the city facility for proper processing." His use of the word processing made Madison's skin crawl. Doyle spoke loudly enough for the camera. "Resources must be allocated responsibly. Cases like these, weak, underdeveloped neonates, are not viable investments." Madison stepped between him and the incubator. "You're not taking them." Doyle smirked, a thin line cutting across his angular face. "I haven't made a decision yet." He turned to say something toward the camera, likely rehearsed, polished, when movement inside the incubator caught everyone's attention. Shadow, still unsteady, pushed himself upright, swaying like a sapling in a storm. Midnight followed, weaker but determined, dragging his small body beside his brother. Together, they stepped, wobbled, toward the edge of the incubator door. They pressed their tiny noses through the metal bars and barked. A single, unified protest. The sound rang out in the silence, soft but unmistakably defiant. Lana's camera zoomed in, trembling slightly in her grip as she captured the moment. 2 black-furred pups, still shaking, still frail, standing guard in front of the woman who refused to abandon them. Doyle's expression tightened. Not anger, not sympathy. Something between dread and calculation. Because he knew the city, knew the internet, would decide the moment that clip went live. And he no longer controlled the narrative. The video spread faster than anyone at Skyline Paws could have imagined. It started as a shaky clip filmed by Lana Ortiz, but within hours it was everywhere. Shared across morning news programs, retweeted by celebrities, and reposted on support forums for veterans, trauma survivors, and animal lovers across the country. The image of 2 trembling black German Shepherd pups, Shadow and Midnight, planting themselves between Madison and authority, became a symbol, a quiet declaration that even the smallest life knew how to stand its ground when love called for it. Donations flooded in. Not just online transfers, but handwritten letters, envelopes sealed with trembling fingers, messages scrawled in shaky cursive. Some came from soldiers who hadn't spoken to anyone in years. Some from widows clutching old medals. Some from teenagers who felt invisible until they saw two tiny dogs refuse to step aside. Many wrote a single line, "They remind me of me." Skyline Paws went from a struggling shelter to the center of a movement almost overnight. Sarah Bennett, slender and quick-eyed, with her soft brown hair tied in its usual messy bun, nearly fainted when she opened the first crate of mail. She spent 3 straight days sorting through stacks of envelopes, her cardigan sleeves rolled up as she tabulated donations with wide, unbelieving eyes. The shelter's debts evaporated. New volunteers poured in. Contractors called with discounted offers to renovate the building. It felt miraculous, unreal, until the city stepped in. But for once it was in the right direction. Richard Doyle returned, the same stiff posture and clipped tone, but something in his eyes had changed. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe self-preservation. Maybe, beneath the bureaucratic armor, there was a spark of humanity long buried. He stood before a small crowd of reporters, tie straightened but voice hesitant. "Skyline Paws," he announced, the words sounding foreign to him, "will serve as a pilot partnership between community resources and the city's welfare program." Cameras flashed. Sarah almost dropped her clipboard. Madison stood behind him with shadow tucked into the crook of her arm. Midnight curled around her ankle like a shadow that refused to leave. As the months passed, both pups transformed. Shadow, the sturdier one with the deep, thoughtful gaze, grew into a regal black shepherd with a calm, anchoring presence. His fur remained dark as midnight oil, and he liked to rest his head against people's legs, as if assuring them he wasn't going anywhere. Midnight, thinner but sharper, developed quick instincts. His nose twitched at every emotional tremor in a room. He had a leaner build, more angular, and his eyes shimmered with alert intelligence. When someone cried, he was the first to press his broad chest against them. Together, they became the heart of Skyline Paws' new program, emotional support training for individuals living with trauma. Madison found herself growing in ways she didn't see coming. The woman who once sealed her emotions inside designer handbags and high-rise offices now spent her evenings in a softly lit counseling room filled with beanbags, blankets, and tea mugs. She listened, really listened, to stories of loss, guilt, fractured sleep, and fractured lives. And each time someone's voice shook or broke, Shadow would slide closer, grounding them with his steady lean, while Midnight would place his forehead against their knee, as if saying, "Let it out. We're here." In helping others heal, Madison found pieces of herself she hadn't realized were missing. She no longer avoided the memory of her fiancé's name. She no longer flinched at the thought of the crash. The guilt didn't disappear, but it softened, reshaped by the presence of two beings who had known abandonment and chose love anyway. One spring evening, the cherry blossoms outside the shelter swayed in a warm breeze, petals drifting across the fenced garden. Madison stepped onto the back patio, the evening light painting gold across her red coat. Fireflies glimmered among the branches. Shadow and Midnight chased each other across the grass, their black coats gleaming against the pale flowers. Watching them run, the very pups who had once been small enough to fit in her palms, Madison felt a slow warmth unfurling in her chest. Not the sharp ache of memory, but something softer. A peace she had once believed she'd never taste again. She sat on the low stone wall and lifted her face toward the sky, the kind of sky that held the scent of rain and renewal. Shadow trotted over, pressing his nose into her hand. Midnight followed, leaping up with that same clumsy enthusiasm he'd had since the beginning, bumping his chest against hers with a huff of affection. Madison wrapped her arms around both of them, laughing as their weight nearly toppled her. "You saved me," she whispered into their fur, voice trembling with truth she could finally say aloud. "That night, I thought I was rescuing you, but really, you were the ones who brought me back." Shadow licked her palm. Midnight nudged her chin. And in that small garden behind Skyline Paws, beneath the blossoms, beside the shelter that had almost been lost, Madison finally understood. No one is beyond saving. Not a dog left in the rain, not a shelter drowning in debt, not a woman who once believed surviving made her unworthy. Spring returned. So had hope. And the two pups who had once been abandoned were now leading others, Madison included, back toward the light. In the quiet glow of Skyline Paws, as Shadow and Midnight curled beside Madison under the blooming spring sky, one truth shone brighter than any morning sun. Miracles don't always arrive with thunder or angels. Sometimes they arrive on four tiny paws, shivering in the rain, waiting for someone brave enough to reach out. Maybe that is how God works in our everyday lives. Not through grand visions, but through small encounters that whisper, "Don't give up. You are needed. You are loved." Just like Madison saved two forgotten pups, and those pups in return saved her weary heart. Each of us carries the power to lift someone from the cold. A neighbor, a friend, a stranger, or even a frightened little life left behind. So tonight, as you close this story, may God bless you and guide your steps through every storm you face. May He bring warmth to your home, healing to your heart, and quiet miracles to your days, the kind you only notice when you stop, look closely, and choose compassion over fear. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of second chances, faith, and the love that binds us all. And may the Lord keep you safe now and always. Amen.